The people who need help the most are usually the ones who ask for it the least. I learned that lesson at 2:17 in the morning. Chicago looked different after midnight. The city never truly slept, but it stopped pretending to be busy. Storefront lights reflected on wet pavement. Traffic thinned. Conversations disappeared. All that remained were the people still working while everyone else rested. I was leaving a meeting that had lasted far longer than it should have when my driver stopped at a red light near a 24-hour convenience store. That was when I saw her. She stood behind the register wearing a blue uniform 2 sizes too large. Blonde hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Tired eyes. A forced smile. Nothing about her seemed unusual at first. Just another employee finishing another late shift. Yet something made me look twice. Maybe it was the way she rubbed her eyes when she thought nobody was watching. Maybe it was the cold coffee sitting beside the register. Or maybe it was the fact that she looked exhausted in a way that sleep alone could not fix. The light turned green. We drove away. I should have forgotten her immediately. Instead, I found myself noticing that same convenience store again the following week. And the week after that. Every time I passed through that part of the city late at night, she was there. Always working. Always smiling at customers. Always looking like she had not slept enough. One night I walked inside. Not because I needed anything. Because curiosity is a difficult thing to ignore. The bell above the door chimed softly. She looked up. "Good evening." Her voice was warm despite the hour. "Can I help you find something?" I glanced around the nearly empty store. "Just coffee. Aisle 3. She smiled politely before returning to inventory sheets spread across the counter. Up close, the exhaustion was even more obvious. Tiny shadows beneath her eyes. Slightly pale skin. The kind of fatigue people carry when they have been running for too long. I bought the coffee. She thanked me. Neither of us said anything else. Yet after that night, I noticed her more often. Sometimes through the store window. Sometimes while passing by. Sometimes because my driver began taking that route without me asking. 3 weeks later, I learned her name. Emily Carter. It happened completely by accident. A customer greeted her while leaving. "Have a good night, Emily." She smiled. "You too." Simple. Ordinary. Yet somehow the name stayed with me. Then came the night everything changed. Rain hammered the city just after 1 in the morning. The kind of rain that turned streets into mirrors. I was leaving another meeting when I saw Emily locking the convenience store doors. Her shift was over. Instead of getting into a car, she walked 2 blocks through the rain toward a bus stop. I watched from across the street. She sat alone beneath the shelter and leaned back against the bench. Within seconds, her eyes closed. She had not meant to fall asleep. Anyone could see that. Her body simply gave up. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The bus arrived. People stepped on. People stepped off. Emily never moved. The driver eventually walked over and gently woke her. She apologized immediately and boarded. As she hurried toward the bus, something slipped from her jacket pocket and landed on the wet sidewalk. She never noticed. The bus pulled away. I crossed the street and picked it up. It was not money. Not an identification card. Not a receipt. It was a hospital bill. And the total printed across the bottom explained exactly why a woman like Emily Carter was working herself into exhaustion. The number printed at the bottom of the hospital bill stayed with me long after I returned home. I had seen larger numbers. Much larger. In my world, people spent that amount on cars, watches, and dinners they barely remembered a week later. But somehow that bill felt heavier than any business contract I had signed that year. Maybe because I knew exactly who was carrying it. Emily Carter, 27 years old, working a night shift while falling asleep at bus stops. The next evening, I told myself I was simply taking my usual route through the city. That explanation lasted until my driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "The convenience store again?" he asked. "It is on the way." He nodded politely without pointing out that it absolutely was not. When I arrived, Emily was already working. The fluorescent lights above the register made her look even more tired than before. Yet when a customer approached, she smiled immediately. Not the fake smile people use because they have to. A real one. Warm. Patient. Genuine. I spent 10 minutes pretending to browse shelves I had no interest in while quietly observing. An elderly man entered carrying exact change in a small envelope. Emily noticed he was short a few dollars. Before he could become embarrassed, she discreetly applied a store coupon from behind the counter. The man left smiling. 30 minutes later, a young mother entered with 2 children. One of the children accidentally dropped a drink bottle. Emily cleaned the mess herself and reassured the woman that everything was fine. No frustration. No annoyance. Just kindness. It made no sense. Most people become harder when life becomes difficult. Emily seemed to become softer. That was unusual. 3 nights later I learned something else. Her shift ended at 6 in the morning. Yet instead of going home, she boarded another bus. Curiosity became concern. Concern became investigation. By 8 o'clock I had my answer. Emily worked a second job. A small diner on the north side of the city. Breakfast shift. 6 days a week. She served coffee, cleaned tables, and carried plates with the same tired smile I had seen at the convenience store. The realization hit harder than expected. She was not working long hours. She was working almost all the time. I sat in a booth near the window one morning and watched quietly. Customers came and went. Emily never stopped moving. Refill coffee. Clear tables. Deliver orders. Smile. Repeat. Around 10:30 the diner slowed down. Emily finally sat down for what appeared to be her first break. She opened her purse. Inside was a small notebook. Not makeup. Not entertainment. Numbers. Pages and pages of handwritten calculations. Bills. Expenses. Payment schedules. Hospital costs. She studied them while eating half of a sandwich. Only half. The other half disappeared into a paper bag she carefully folded closed. Later that afternoon I discovered why. When her shift ended, Emily did not go home. She went to St. Mary's Medical Center. Through the hospital lobby window, I watched her walk directly toward a patient room carrying that paper bag. A few minutes later, an older woman smiled the moment Emily entered. The resemblance was unmistakable. Same eyes. Same smile. Same quiet strength. Emily handed her the sandwich and sat beside the bed. Then she spent the next hour pretending everything was fine. That was the moment I understood something important. Emily was not working herself to exhaustion because she wanted a better life. She was doing it because someone she loved needed her to. And suddenly every sleepless night made perfect sense. After that day, I stopped asking myself why Emily Carter worked so hard. I already knew the answer. The better question was how long she could keep doing it. The human body has limits. Pride does not. Every time I saw her, she looked a little more exhausted. Yet she never complained. Not once. 2 weeks passed. Then one rainy Thursday morning, I found myself sitting inside the diner again. Emily was carrying a tray of coffee cups when one of the older regular customers waved her over. "You look tired, kid." Emily laughed softly. "That obvious? You need a vacation. Maybe next year." The customer smiled. "That is what you said last year." Emily's smile faded for half a second. Then she recovered. "I am saving up." It was a harmless conversation. Yet something about the way she said it bothered me. She was not saving for a vacation. She was saving for survival. Later that morning, after the lunch crowd arrived, I watched her quietly help a young college student who could not afford his full meal. She paid the difference herself without making a scene. The amount was less than $10. Most people would not notice. Emily noticed. That was the difference. The next day, I saw her at the convenience store again. Around midnight, a homeless veteran entered carrying a handful of coins. He stood in front of the coffee machine counting them twice before putting the cup back. Emily waited until he turned away. Then she filled a fresh cup and placed it on the counter. "Store promotion," she said with a smile. "Free tonight." The man looked surprised. "Really? Really?" He thanked her 3 times before leaving. Emily watched him go and returned to work as if nothing had happened. No audience. No recognition. Just kindness. The kind people show when nobody is watching. Unfortunately, life seemed determined to test her anyway. 3 days later, I arrived at St. Mary's Medical Center just as Emily was leaving her mother's room. Her shoulders were tense. Her eyes looked distant. Something had changed. She stopped at the billing office before heading toward the exit. Through the glass wall, I saw a hospital administrator hand her several new documents. Emily read them, then read them again. The color slowly disappeared from her face. She thanked the woman politely, folded the papers and walked away. Once outside, she sat alone on a bench near the parking lot. For the first time since I had known her, she looked defeated. Not emotional, not angry, just overwhelmed. She opened the paperwork and stared at it for nearly 10 minutes. Eventually, she buried her face in her hands. I remained inside my car across the street. Part of me wanted to walk over immediately. Another part understood that strangers do not suddenly appear and solve problems. Not in real life. Yet I could not stop thinking about her. That evening, I learned what the new paperwork contained. Additional treatment recommendations. New procedures. More expenses. Necessary expenses. The total made the original hospital bill look small. Emily was already working 2 jobs. There was no third job available in the day. No extra hours left to sell. Mathematics can be cruel that way. There are moments when effort alone stops being enough. The following night, I entered the convenience store shortly before closing. Emily stood behind the register reviewing numbers inside the same notebook I had seen at the diner. Every page was covered with calculations, bills, payment dates, work schedules, tiny handwritten sacrifices. She did not notice me at first. Then she looked up and smiled automatically. The smile lasted exactly 1 second before exhaustion returned. And for the first time since meeting her, I realized something terrifying. Emily was not afraid of hard work. She was afraid that even hard work would not be enough. There are moments when a problem becomes so large that determination alone cannot carry it any farther. I recognized that look in Emily's eyes because I had seen it before. Not in hospitals. Not in diners. In boardrooms. In negotiations. In people who suddenly realize they have reached the edge of what they can control. The difference was that most of those people had resources. Emily had only herself. For the next several days, I watched her routine become even more demanding. She arrived earlier, stayed later, accepted every extra shift available. The notebook never left her side. Every spare minute was spent calculating numbers that refused to cooperate. One afternoon, while finishing lunch at the diner, I noticed a young waitress accidentally drop an entire tray of glasses. The crash silenced the room. The manager rushed over. The waitress looked terrified. Before anyone could react, Emily stepped forward and quietly accepted responsibility for helping clean everything. She even stayed after her shift ended to assist. Not because she had caused the accident, because someone else was struggling. That was who she was. A week later, I witnessed something similar at the convenience store. A nervous teenager stood at the register trying to buy medicine and a few groceries. His card was declined. Twice. Embarrassment spread across his face. Emily glanced at the total, opened her wallet, and covered the difference herself. The teenager thanked her repeatedly. Emily simply smiled and returned to work. By then, I understood something that made the entire situation harder to ignore. She was giving away kindness she could not afford. Meanwhile, life continued demanding more from her. One evening, after visiting her mother at St. Mary's Medical Center, Emily remained in the hospital cafeteria long after visiting hours ended. I happened to be there meeting with a charitable foundation connected to the hospital. From across the room, I watched her sit alone with a paper cup of coffee. She was reviewing documents. Again, hospital estimates, treatment schedules, payment options. The pages seemed endless. Eventually, she lowered her head and closed her eyes. Not sleeping, just gathering strength. A few minutes later, her phone rang. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet when it ended, she looked even more worried. The next day, I discovered why. Her apartment building had announced a rent increase beginning the following month. Another expense. Another obstacle. Another impossible number added to an already impossible equation. Most people would have broken under that pressure. Emily did not. She simply worked harder. That frightened me more than if she had complained. Because people can only run on determination for so long. Sooner or later, exhaustion collects its debt. Then came the night that changed everything. I entered the convenience store shortly before closing, and found Emily standing behind the register as usual. At first nothing seemed different. Then I noticed her hands. They were trembling slightly while counting receipts. She blinked several times as if trying to focus. The color had disappeared from her face. Even her smile seemed difficult to maintain. A customer asked a simple question. Emily answered politely. Then she reached for a receipt and nearly dropped it. For a brief second, she leaned against the counter for support. Nobody else noticed. I did. She recovered immediately and continued working. But the image stayed with me. When I returned to my car, I sat there for nearly 10 minutes staring at the store entrance. The city lights reflected across the windshield. Rain began falling again. And for the first time since this began, I stopped wondering whether I should get involved. The real question was how much longer Emily Carter could carry the weight of an entire world by herself. Some people earn respect through power. Others earn it through money. Emily Carter earned it through the way she treated people when she had every reason not to. The more I watched her, the more impossible she became to ignore. Not because she was extraordinary in the way magazines describe extraordinary people. She was extraordinary in the way most people never notice. Quietly. Consistently. Without asking for credit. One Saturday morning, I arrived at the diner earlier than usual. The breakfast crowd had already filled half the tables. Emily moved through the room carrying coffee pots and order pads with the efficiency of someone who had repeated the same routine thousands of times. Yet something was different. Her exhaustion had become impossible to hide. The shadows beneath her eyes seemed darker. Her movements slightly slower. Even her smile required visible effort. During a brief lull, she sat alone in a corner booth and closed her eyes for less than a minute. Not sleeping. Just resting. Then she stood and returned to work before anyone could ask questions. Around noon, an elderly woman entered the diner using a walker. Every table was occupied. Before the hostess could react, Emily gave up her own break table and helped the woman sit comfortably. She even brought extra napkins and a glass of water without being asked. The woman smiled gratefully. Emily simply nodded and continued working. Later that afternoon, after finishing her shift, she boarded a bus towards St. Mary's Medical Center. I followed at a distance. The hospital room looked brighter than usual when she entered. Her mother seemed to be having a good day. For nearly an hour they laughed together. Emily shared stories from work. Her mother listened carefully. Neither mentioned bills. Neither mentioned treatments. Neither mentioned fear. They protected each other from those conversations. That realization stayed with me. Emily was not only carrying financial burdens, she was carrying emotional ones too. She spent every day pretending to be stronger than she felt, because someone she loved needed hope. The following week brought more evidence of who she truly was. A severe storm hit the city late one evening. Rain flooded several streets. Public transportation slowed. Most customers rushed through the convenience store and disappeared into the night. Near closing time, a delivery driver entered looking exhausted and frustrated. His order had been delayed for hours because of the weather. Emily listened patiently while he complained. Then she handed him a fresh cup of coffee and a packaged sandwich. "Long night?" she asked. The driver nodded. "The longest." "Then dinner is on me." The man tried to refuse. Emily insisted. It was another small act. Another invisible kindness. Another reminder that she somehow continued giving while life kept taking. That night, after leaving the store, I remained parked across the street longer than usual. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. My phone rang several times. Business matters. Meetings.
Décision worth millions.
None of them felt particularly important. Instead, I found myself thinking about a woman who measured every dollar and still found ways to help strangers. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I knew people with unlimited resources who spent every waking moment protecting their own interests. Emily had almost nothing and somehow kept protecting everyone else. Then another piece of information reached me. The hospital had approved the next phase of her mother's treatment. Good news on the surface. Except for the cost. The estimate was significantly higher than before. Much higher. I stared at the paperwork for several minutes. The numbers confirmed what I already suspected. Emily had reached a point where effort alone would no longer solve the problem. Yet if I had learned anything about her, it was this. She would never ask for help. Which meant if help was going to reach her, it would have to find another way. The first rule was simple. If I was going to help Emily Carter, she could never feel like a charity case. The second rule was even more important. She could never know it came from me. People often assume money solves problems. Sometimes it does. But pride is different. Pride can keep a person standing when everything else falls apart. I had no intention of taking that away from her. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. One of the charitable programs connected to St. Mary's Medical Center was expanding its patient assistance fund. The foundation regularly reviewed cases involving long-term treatment expenses. Normally, the process took months. This time I made a phone call, then another. A week later, Emily's mother's application moved to the top of the review list. Nothing illegal. Nothing dishonest. Just a door opening slightly faster than usual. The next afternoon, I watched Emily leave the billing office looking confused. Not upset. Not exhausted. Confused. She stopped in the hallway and reread the paperwork twice. Then she called someone immediately. By the expression on her face, the conversation brought good news. A portion of the upcoming treatment costs had been approved for assistance. Not all of it. Just enough to let her breathe. For the first time in weeks, her shoulders seemed lighter. The change was small, but it mattered. A few days later, another opportunity appeared. The owner of the diner planned to promote someone into a daytime supervisory role. Better schedule. Better pay. More predictable hours. Emily deserved it more than anyone. Unfortunately, she had never applied. She assumed someone else needed it more. That sounded exactly like her. So I arranged a conversation between the owner and a consultant from one of my hospitality companies. During that discussion, Emily's name came up naturally. Her work ethic, her reliability, her ability to handle pressure. 2 days later, she was offered the position. I happened to be sitting near the window when the owner told her. Emily looked completely stunned. "Are you sure?" she asked. The owner laughed. "You practically run this place already." For several seconds, Emily could not speak. Then she smiled. A real smile. The kind I had not seen in a very long time. Better pay meant fewer overnight hours. Fewer overnight hours meant more sleep. More sleep meant a better chance of surviving everything life kept throwing at her. Yet the most unexpected change happened at the convenience store. One evening, the manager approached her with a new schedule. Her shifts were being adjusted. Fewer back-to-back overnight assignments. More consistent hours. Emily stared at the paper. "Why?" she asked. The manager shrugged. "Corporate recommendations." She looked puzzled but grateful. Watching from across the street, I found myself smiling. Sometimes help does not need applause. Sometimes it only needs results. Over the following weeks, subtle improvements continued appearing in her life. Her mother's treatment progressed well. The diner promotion worked out better than expected. The endless exhaustion that had haunted her face began fading little by little. Not completely, but enough to notice. Then one evening, something happened that I had not anticipated. I entered the diner for dinner and found Emily sitting alone during her break. For once, there was no notebook full of calculations. No stack of bills. Just a cup of tea and a quiet moment. She looked up and recognized me immediately. We had exchanged polite greetings before, but nothing more. This time she smiled. "You come here a lot." I laughed softly. I was about to say the same thing. For the first time since this began, we actually talked. And as I sat across from her listening to her speak, I realized something that made everything far more dangerous than any problem money could solve. Somewhere along the way, helping Emily Carter had stopped feeling like a responsibility. It had become personal. For a while, I believed the arrangement would remain invisible forever. Emily's life was improving. Her mother's condition was stabilizing. The promotion at the diner was working out exactly as intended. Most importantly, she was beginning to look like someone who remembered what hope felt like. Then reality reminded me that secrets rarely stay hidden. It started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was finishing a meeting when my phone rang. The caller was one of the administrators connected to the hospital foundation. His voice sounded uneasy. "There is a problem," he said. "Problems come in many forms." This one arrived as a simple question. Emily had requested information about the assistance program that approved part of her mother's treatment expenses. She wanted to understand how her application moved through the process so quickly. The administrator had answered honestly. Too honestly. By that evening, Emily had begun connecting pieces that were never supposed to fit together. The next day, I walked into the diner and immediately knew something was wrong. Emily was working, but her smile was missing. Her movements were precise, controlled, distant. When she noticed me, her expression changed completely. Not relief, not happiness, frustration. "Can we talk?" she asked. The words were polite. The tone was not. A few minutes later, we sat across from each other in an empty corner booth. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows. The restaurant noise seemed miles away. Emily placed a folder on the table between us. Hospital paperwork. Foundation documents. Notes. She had done her homework. "How long?" she asked quietly. I already knew what she meant. "How long what? How long have you been helping me?" There are moments when lying becomes impossible. This was one of them. I remained silent. Emily laughed once. There was no humor in it. "That long?" She looked down at the papers. "The assistance program. The promotion. The schedule changes." Her eyes lifted toward mine. Was any of it real? The question hit harder than I expected. Of course it was real. Then why does it feel like everyone knew something I did not? For the first time since meeting her, genuine anger appeared. Not because she hated me, because she hated feeling powerless. "Do you know what hurts?" she asked. "I worked every hour I could find. I gave up everything. And then suddenly things started getting better." Her voice trembled slightly. I thought maybe I had finally earned it. Understanding arrived immediately. This was never about the help itself. It was about ownership. Emily wanted her victories to belong to her. I respected that. "You did earn it," I said. She shook her head. "Did I?" "Yes." My answer came faster than expected. "Every single thing that changed happened because of who you are." She looked unconvinced. So I continued. "The foundation approved assistance because your mother's case deserved it. The diner promoted you because you were already doing the job. The schedule changed because anyone paying attention could see you were carrying too much." Emily stared at me silently. "I did not create those things," I said. "I only made sure people notice what should have been obvious from the beginning." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she looked away. Tears appeared, though she seemed annoyed by them. "I never wanted anyone to save me." "I know. Then why?" That question mattered more than all the others. I considered my answer carefully. "Because I spent months watching someone give everything she had for other people." My voice softened. And eventually I realized nobody was doing the same for her. Emily looked down at her hands. The anger was fading now, replaced by something more complicated. And as silence settled between us, I realized the truth had finally arrived. Whatever happened next, neither of our lives would be the same again. The conversation stayed with me long after I left the diner that afternoon. Not because Emily had discovered the truth. That part had always been inevitable. What stayed with me was the look in her eyes when she finally understood that someone had been paying attention. For months she had carried every burden alone. Then suddenly she was forced to confront a possibility she had never considered. Maybe she had never been as invisible as she thought. We did not speak for several days after that. Not because we were angry, because some truths need time to settle. Emily continued working at the diner. She continued visiting her mother. Life moved forward the way it always does, one day at a time. Then one evening my phone rang. The caller surprised me. "Emily." For a moment, I simply stared at the screen before answering. "Hello." Silence lingered briefly. Then her voice appeared, softer than before. "My mother wants to meet you." I smiled despite myself. "That sounds serious." "Very serious," Emily replied. "She has been asking questions." 2 days later, I found myself standing inside St. Mary's Medical Center once again. Emily met me outside her mother's room. She looked different. Not dramatically different. Just lighter. healthier. The constant exhaustion that had once surrounded her seemed to be fading. "You are nervous," she said. "I negotiate billion-dollar agreements." "That is not a denial." Before I could respond, she laughed. It was the first completely carefree laugh I had ever heard from her. Inside the room, her mother greeted me like an old friend. Within minutes, she was telling stories about Emily as a child. Emily rolled her eyes repeatedly while her mother ignored every attempt to stop her. I listened quietly. Stories about school projects, volunteer work, stray animals brought home unexpectedly, small acts of kindness stretching back decades. None of it surprised me. If anything, it confirmed everything I already knew. Eventually, her mother became serious. She looked at me carefully. "Thank you," she said. Simple words. Honest words. I started to respond, but she raised her hand gently. "Not for the money." My attention sharpened immediately. For seeing her. The room fell silent. Emily looked down. Her mother continued. "Most people only notice strength when it is loud." She smiled warmly. "You noticed hers when nobody else did." Those words stayed with me for the rest of the week. Meanwhile, more good news arrived. Her mother's treatment was working. The doctors were optimistic. For the first time in a very long time, the future no longer felt like something to fear. One Saturday afternoon, Emily invited me to walk through a neighborhood community fair near the lake. Families filled the sidewalks. Food trucks lined the streets. Children ran between booths carrying balloons. Felt strangely normal. And somehow that made it extraordinary. As we wandered through the crowd, Emily stopped in front of a small community center displaying local education programs. Her attention immediately focused on a reading initiative for underprivileged children. The passion in her expression was impossible to miss. "I used to dream about something like this," she admitted. "A place where kids could read, learn, and feel safe." "What happened?" I asked. She smiled sadly. "Life." We continued walking, but the conversation stayed with me. Later that evening, while watching the sunset reflect across Lake Michigan, I realized something important. For months, Emily had been fighting to save her mother's future. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten about her own. And standing there beside her, listening to dreams she thought were no longer possible, I found myself wondering whether the next chapter of her story was only just beginning. 1 year later, I found myself standing outside a renovated brick building on the north side of Chicago. The morning air carried the first signs of autumn. Golden leaves drifted across the sidewalk. Families gathered near the entrance. Children laughed while volunteers arranged tables filled with books. Above the doorway hung a simple sign that meant more than most people would ever understand. Carter Community Reading Center. I smiled the moment I saw it. Emily's dream had finally become real. Not because someone handed it to her. Because she never stopped moving toward it, even when life gave her every reason to quit. The difference now was that she finally had room to breathe. Her mother's recovery had continued beyond everyone's expectations. The woman who once spent her days in a hospital room now volunteered twice a week at the reading center. She greeted visitors near the entrance with the same warm smile Emily had inherited. Watching them together felt like witnessing a miracle built from thousands of small sacrifices. Inside, the building looked exactly the way Emily once described during our walk by the lake. Comfortable reading corners, bright classrooms, shelves filled with donated books, community programs for children and families. Every detail reflected her heart. Every room reflected her belief that everyone deserved a chance to learn, grow, and feel seen. The official opening ceremony ended around noon. Local residents filled the space. Teachers arrived. Parents explored the building with their children. Throughout it all, Emily moved from room to room greeting people and answering questions. She looked different than the woman I first saw behind a convenience store register. Not because success had changed her. Because exhaustion no longer defined her. Confidence had replaced survival. Purpose had replaced fear. Later that afternoon, after most visitors had left, the building finally grew quiet. Sunlight streamed through the large front windows. Books rested neatly on shelves. The scent of fresh paint mixed with paper and coffee. Emily stood near one of the reading rooms looking around as though she still could not believe it existed. "You built it," I said. She laughed softly. "We built it." I shook my head. No. This started long before me. Her eyes moved across the room. Maybe. Then she smiled. But I would not be standing here without you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply looked at the space around us. A year earlier, she had been calculating hospital bills between shifts. Now children would spend years discovering new possibilities inside these walls. That kind of change never happens overnight. It happens one decision at a time. One act of kindness at a time. One person believing in another when they no longer believe in themselves. Emily walked toward a framed photograph hanging near the entrance. It showed her mother smiling during one of the first volunteer days. Beneath the photograph was a small plaque with a simple message. Hope grows where people care. She touched the frame gently. I used to think strength meant carrying everything alone, she said quietly. Now? I asked. She looked toward me. Now I think strength means letting people care about you too. The answer stayed with me. Outside, the afternoon sun painted long shadows across the sidewalk. Families continued arriving. Children continued running toward the bookshelves. Life continued moving forward. And as I watched Emily welcome another group through the front doors, I realized something important. The greatest investment I ever made had nothing to do with business. It was believing that one extraordinary woman deserved the same kindness she spent her entire life giving away. Because sometimes the people who work the hardest to save everyone else are the ones waiting for someone to finally notice them. And sometimes changing a life begins with something as simple as paying attention.